Welcome to Occupations, the podcast, where we discuss what it's like to hold specific jobs. Occupations is brought to you by lotsofmaps.com, where you fulfill your vintage map gifting needs. Visit lotsofmaps.com.
Hello and welcome again to Occupations, the podcast, where we talk about folks that have really interesting jobs. And this week we're talking to Cory Trembath-Rouillard, who is a preservation architect at Henson Architecture in New York City. She's going to tell us a little bit about her job and what she does, and I think you're going to find it kind of cool. So welcome, Cory.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you here. Cory, where are you from?
So I live in New York City.
Yep.
I'm originally from upstate New York. I've lived in New York. I've lived up here in Boston for a while. I'm back in the city, and I've been there for about 10 years now.
Excellent.
Second time around.
Wow,
Yes.
10 years.
10 years.
Can't believe it's been that long. Tell me a little bit about what is a preservation architect?
So I am an architect. I'm a licensed architect. I went through the schooling. I went and got my license, all of the things that any architect does, except rather than designing brand new buildings on brand new sites, I work on existing buildings. Very often they're historically significant, and we take care of them and we understand what's going on with them and make sure that they're in good working order. We'll do a lot in terms of understanding what the history is. Sometimes we'll restore the building back to a certain time period or to something that was really important. There's this idea in preservation where we talk about the period of significance. So, for example, Susan B. Anthony's house.
Ooh.
She lived in a house, and this is something that I did forever
I
ago.
thought you lived on a coin.
Yes, she does. All of the famous people just live on coins. If you're working on, for example, at a famous person's house, they're not necessarily the last person who lived there.
Right.
And what can be important was understanding that person's life. Somebody famous lived in a house, and if we were to restore that back to becoming a house museum, what is generally the most important is understanding their life. And so there may have been 3 or 4 owners since then, and they lived in the house like anybody did and would make changes. And so we may want to bring that back to that famous person's lifetime to understand what it was like when they lived there, because at that point, it's more about understanding the person rather than the building.
That's great.
In other cases, it's more about what the building is or the changes that have happened to it over time. But in all of those cases, you end up spending quite a bit of time doing research. Sometimes it's historic documentation, finding writings, finding old drawings, finding things like that. And sometimes it's really looking at the building itself and understanding how to read things in the building, where you can actually find evidence in the walls. You can find traces of things. You can see where, well, we know that the roof line looked a little bit differently before, but we don't know exactly what was going on. You can sometimes go to the building and you can see the traces of that.
That's great. Tell me a little bit about your education.
I went to school at RPI, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, which is in upstate New York. They have a really excellent architecture program. Architecture programs there are a couple different paths, but probably the most direct route is a 5-year bachelor's of architecture degree. You can also do a bachelor's in something and get a master's. And so depending on what your education route is, it's typically, I think, 5 to 7 years of education. I knew when I was about 11 that I wanted to be an architect.
Ooh,
and so
that was going to be my next question, but
Yes.
we'll talk about that later. Keep going.
Yeah. And so at that point, I'm like, well, this is what I want to do. I don't want to, so I picked a 5-year program. I'm quite happy with the program that I went to, and I learned an awful lot about how to be an architect and, all the things you need to do. And then from there, you have to work for at least 3 years before you're able to take the licensing exam. Oh. Some of the things have changed since then, but you have to work at least 3 years before you earn your license. Okay. The licensing exam has also changed over time. It's the same amount of work, but at the time that I took it, it was 9 separate exams that you take. So it took me about a year to take all of the different sections of the exam and pass them. And once you pass all of them, then you are able to earn your license.
So meanwhile, you were working in the field?
I was working full time at that point, yeah.
So what was your position at that point? You obviously couldn't be an architect, but were you an assistant or something?
Yeah, so yes. So I worked in an architecture firm. The titles will vary. It's a field where you cannot legally call yourself an architect without having a license. But there are a lot of things, other ways that you can say things like you're an architectural designer or you are I think my title in that first office at that point, you start off as like saying you're an architectural intern or something. I'd worked in just growing in in my capabilities through the office.
Of course.
By the time I got my license, my title within the office was project architect, but I always had to be careful to say that I'm not a licensed architect yet until I finally was. And then I'm like, yes, I am an architect.
So it took you 3 years to become an architect, or
It took me longer than that. And
Okay.
it just had to do with some of the complications just in terms of getting paperwork through, just sitting down and doing some of that. The reality, you track your time all the way through. And then at a certain point, you have to submit all of that to the national board and to your state where you're applying to get your license. And depending on what's going on there, it's set up in a way where they want to make sure that you were getting experience in a lot of different aspects.
Sure.
And in my office at the time, I was working on some really big projects, and I was spending a lot of time in one area of expertise, or a couple of the aspects, but there are other parts that I didn't get right away,
Sure.
which was fine because I wasn't planning on going anywhere. I'm like, yes, I'm going to do this eventually. And
Right.
once I get all of the right types of experience, then I will sit down and actually take the time to
Sure.
get all the paperwork in and get my license and all of that.
Absolutely.
I think I got all of the paperwork in. I had been working for about 7 years. By the time I got my license, I had been working for 8 or more at that point. And then, once you get it, then it takes a while for the paperwork to go through from the state, from the national board, and then you apply to the AIA if you so choose, which is the American Institute for Architects. In each of these things, there's time involved with all of that.
Sure.
Just because of the way my early career path worked, and for a number of other things, it took me a little bit longer, but not in an unreasonable way. It was more that I was getting a lot of really amazing experience that I didn't want to request within the office, hey, can I do this other thing? Because I wanted to keep going on those projects where I was.
Sure.
So, but it takes different people, different amounts of time, depending on what's going on in their lives.
So I'm going to ask you kind of a wacky question here. You went to school for 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
You learned certain things, obviously, and then you worked as an assistant.
Mm-hmm.
Did you feel like hands-on in the job was moving faster, your education, than school was?
I would say I learned a lot in both.
Okay.
And I don't know that one is more than the other. They were different things. The reason that you have to work for at least 3 years is because they understand you're not going to learn everything that you need to do before you can take the licensing exam. The license is really intended to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the people who are in your buildings. So it's not about, it's a fancy design, it's any of that kind of stuff. It's about making sure that the building is going to be standing up, people are going to be safe. If anything were to happen, they can get out of the building safely. That's what the license is intended for. You learn a ton in school, a lot about design, a lot about all the different aspects of it. They're parts that you're not going to learn quite as well
Sure.
in school. And so some of it makes sense in an academic setting, and some of it makes much more sense in practice.
Yep.
The other part that that goes along with it is that I never worked in a typical architecture firm. So I grew up north of Albany, and when I was looking for summer internships, I was looking to live at home and find a job. And Albany is it's not a huge area, and so there are only so many firms. And I managed to get an offer to work as an intern in a firm that did historic preservation. I didn't fully understand what that meant. And I felt like in my career, like what I wanted to do when I grew up, I wanted to do something that was sustainable design, even though I didn't directly have the words for that. I don't think we were talking about it as a profession. We weren't quite talking about it that way, but I wanted to do something that was sustainable in some way. And I fell into it. Like my first job was with a preservation architecture firm. And so I didn't know what to expect with it, but I loved it. And I got to work on some really amazing things, and I learned some amazing things, and I've been working in preservation ever since. But what that means on that side is that while I was learning the on-the-job part of being an architect, I was also learning a lot about preservation, which is slightly different than what you learn in terms of working on a new building. And so I was kind of getting a second round of education. And it's a field that people will go back to school for. And so rather than going back to school for it, I was just working in really excellent firms, learning this stuff and learning from a lot of the people who were developing an awful lot in that field. I learned a lot on the job, just like I learned a lot in school. They were just different things that I learned. I wanted to do some sort of sustainable design, and I was working in a preservation firm, and I loved it. But I was feeling like for the longest time, like, I love what I'm doing, but ultimately what I want to do in my career is maybe not this.
Right.
I want to do this other thing. And I saw them as two separate things.
Mm-hmm.
It took me about 7 years before I realized that the most sustainable thing I could do in this field is to work in preservation. And it took me that long. And when I figured that out, I did the biggest happy dance. I was so excited. This is the coolest thing ever. Oh my God, this is what I love.
You're on the right path already.
Right.
Which is big,
right? I
right?
just so happened. Yeah. It was kind of an interesting, really cool happenstance with that. But to be fair, I think the industry at that point was viewing it as two separate things. There was you can hang on to the old buildings and take care of it, and the cultural heritage that goes with it, and understanding all of the history and all of the building technology, or the history of the people, or the who lived there or worked there, or how that shaped all of these different things in our history. But it's a leaky old building was the perception, right? And there's a lot of that where I felt very torn. By about 2007, that's when there were some very vocal people who were writing some really amazing things, like some people who are the people who I still look up to today, who were talking about the fact that, no, the most important thing you can do is hang on to the building.
Do you think someday you'll maybe be one of those architects who, designs a brand new building in Dubai, the biggest whatever? Is that something that you ever thought of doing? Is something like crazy architect? When you think of an architect, you always think modern, or that's what goes through my mind. But was that ever a dream of yours?
Globally, no.
Yeah.
There were points in time, especially like when I first got to school and you're introduced to all of these other things that are going on. There were some of the like really out there things. I'm like, oh my God, this is amazing. This is so cool. I want to, co-op Himmelblaus, and like they were crazy out there designers from Austria in the 60s and 70s, and they were writing these manifestos and doing all of these wild things. And then there were people who were doing these crazy formal, twisty-turny, bendy buildings and everything that I hadn't seen before, really. And I'm like, oh my God, this is so much cooler than the boring boxes I see all the time, right? But for the most part, I wasn't ever really in the mindset of, I want to build a giant skyscraper and I want to, that wasn't ever my driving force.
Okay. So I'm going to assume that your love of architecture came from the Brady Bunch, that Mike Brady was an architect. Am I wrong about that?
You were totally wrong about that, actually.
I assumed everyone wanted to be an architect
Right?
when they saw that.
Right, especially when you have two bedrooms for 6 kids crammed into one little bathroom. I don't know how they were supposed
Not
to have
good
made
planning,
that work.
yeah.
No.
But it was cool because he'd bring home tubes of like blueprints and stuff every
Right.
night. He'd always be walking around with tubes, and it was like, I want to carry tubes someday.
That was what it was. It was the tubes of drawings. No, not at all.
So what was it? So you said, like, what did you say, 9?
I was 11.
11.
Yeah.
So what was it was there an experience that you had that sort of turned you on to it?
There kind of was.
Okay.
So I grew up in a suburb that was, when I first moved there, when we moved there, I was 6. And you got off the highway and you drove down this road that was all wooded on both sides. There was a little bit right at the exit, but then you just drive down through the woods for the longest time until you turn into the housing development. And by the time I was 10 or 11, there was a lot more development that was happening there. And when you turned down the long wooded road, someone had come in and just flattened an entire, I don't know how many acres, took down all the trees, then plunked in a for sale sign, and it turned into a giant strip mall.
Yeah.
And as an 11-year-old, I was despondent. I took this big long walk with my mom around the neighborhood. We were walking the dog or something. And I'm like, oh my God, by the time I grow up, the entire world is going to be covered with pavement. This is awful. This is devastating. The poor animals, the poor trees. I was really upset. And my mom said, yeah, this is pretty awful, but keep in mind, we do still need buildings. And she said, but like, there are a lot of things that you can do. I think the part that stuck with me, she's like, whenever there's a big problem in the world, you can imagine it being like a runaway train. You can stand by and watch it go by and shake your head and say, oh, it's a shame. Or you can run up and try to take control and kind of slow down that train, be like the train engineer and really do something to make a difference.
Right.
And so what you really want to do is find a way to make a difference. And she gave me a whole bunch of examples. And I don't remember what all of them were. And she was just kind of brainstorming and talking to me about things like, for example, you could become a biologist. You could become a botanist. You could do something where you're worrying about the trees. You could do something, you could become a journalist or whatever it was that she was talking about. I don't remember what all of that was, but she was talking about a whole bunch of different things.
You could be a protester.
You could be a protester. I don't think she was encouraging that.
Doesn't pay very well.
Right. But it's somewhere along there, she's like, or you could become an architect. I mean, we do need buildings. We're not going to stop buildings. We still need to live in them. We still need to do that. But maybe we design them differently. What if instead of cutting down the trees, maybe you build buildings around the trees and have the trees growing up through the middle of them? And as a kid, I'm like, whoa. That's just really cool. And that was the one that stuck with me.
Wow.
And when I was 11, I mean, that was a point in time that, you know, you go to school and you always fill out like, oh, yeah, my favorite color is blue. My favorite food's pizza. I want to be a teacher when I grow up or a doctor or a fireman or whatever. Like you knew about 5 professions, right? Right. And so at that point when everyone was, you know, rattling off one of those 5 professions, I'm like, and I want to be an architect. And people are like, wait, what? What does that mean? That? Yeah. Right? So why? And what kind of buildings do you want to build? And I had no idea. Sure. I'm like, I don't know. I want to have trees growing through the middle of them. But and I was able to take some classes in junior high and high school and able to do some stuff with that. And yeah, all of the quintessential where everybody's like, oh, I wanted to be an architect, but I wasn't good at math. I wanted to be an architect, but I couldn't draw. To be honest, neither of those things that should be the things that turn you off from that profession. But I happen to like both of those. Right. And so none of these things were preventing me from wanting to go in this direction. Right. I had an opportunity when I was in high school to take a college level class at RPI, and I took a class, which happened to be it was like a architecture class for high school students. And I took the class and I loved it. And I'm like, yeah, this is definitely what I want to do. I think that was actually at the point when I learned about that firm from the 60s who did this crazy manifesto, whatever. But regardless, I really loved that. And I continued. And so I went to school for it. I went to RPI. I studied there for 5 years. And I got into it that way. So it was about what I was seeing in my hometown, watching it turn into a bunch of strip malls and turning it into asphalt. And I'm like, no, I want to do something better than this.
Well, and it's funny how something, you know, when you're young really sticks with you. Sometimes it just clicks, right?
Yeah.
Did you ever design that house with the tree growing up through the middle?
No.
Did you draw it at least when you were a kid?
Oh, I'm sure I must have. Yeah. I couldn't tell you exactly.
Promise me you're going to do that someday for real.
Awesome.
Where is that drawing now?
That's the question.
All right. So, Cory, tell me a little bit about your day-to-day. And I'm sure every day's different, but what kind of things are you doing during the day? It sounds like there's research involved and all kinds of other things, but tell me a little more.
Well, it does vary from day to day because there are a lot of different pieces involved in what I do. It depends on the project that I'm working on at that moment, and there's always more than one going on. It depends on what phase of the project it's in, because a project will go from writing a proposal and going after the job and saying to the client, this is why you should hire us. This is the stuff that we do, to putting together the fee proposal for it, signing the contract, all that stuff. And then very often it'll start at the beginning. Typically, we need to do some research into the history of the building and understand what's going on there. Sometimes it's an existing conditions assessment, meaning we'll go and look at the building and poke around and see what's going on where, say, on a project where they're getting leaks in the building. We need to figure out what's going on and understand that before we can say, this is what needs to be done. We need to see what's going on there first to then put together, this is what the project needs to be.
What size buildings are we talking about?
Oh, it varies. Typically. So it really varies. Okay. Sometimes it'll be, if it's a house museum, let's say, it'll be single family house, but generally I'm not working on something that scale. Sometimes, like I'm in New York City now, so it's
Sure.
kind of a different scale anyway.
Absolutely.
Some of those are, say, a townhouse, but we also in this office we do an awful lot of work on buildings that are 6 stories or taller.
Okay.
a lot of that has to do with the fact that we do a lot of work on buildings where we're looking at the exterior of the building and making sure it's safe. New York City has a series of laws where they need to make sure that the buildings are safe so that when you're walking down the sidewalk, you don't have a brick fall down and hit you on the head.
Yeah,
that's not exactly,
bad.
Yeah, might hurt a little bit.
If it were to happen anywhere, New York would be the place that would happen, right?
Well, there are an awful lot of buildings.
Not your
a lot
fault. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying.
No, but I mean, a lot of buildings right next to the sidewalk, and there was something that happened like that a few decades ago, where something fell off and killed a woman walking down the street. And so ever since, they've had a series of laws where any building of a certain height, so 6 stories and taller, you have to inspect the outside of the building every 5 years. And if there's something that's not safe, you have to fix it.
To be fair, Boston has had that as well. The John Hancock building.
Right.
With
the glass.
Windows would just fall out. Yeah.
And this is, and that kind of, there was a very specific reason why that happened. And going back and looking at it, they were able to figure something out. And that actually changed a certain amount of what happens in building technology.
Elmer's glue just isn't that
No,
good.
you had to go to Gorilla Glue, right? No,
exactly.
But no, I mean, to be fair, that there really was a lot of building technology changes that had to happen in understanding what happened with that one. But I've worked on buildings of a number of different scales. I've worked on cathedrals. I've worked on churches. I've worked on buildings that were originally insane asylums that were then converted into other things. Right now, we're working on a 1804 townhouse, and we're working on a mansion in Brooklyn, and we're working on a couple buildings that were originally factory buildings that were converted to multifamily, so a co-op building. Because we're typically working on historic properties, that means that they're generally 50 years or older, but that's not always the case. But a lot of the skill set of understanding how to look at and investigate older buildings also goes to buildings that are more recent in terms of understanding how they're constructed, what is and is not working, and how to fix it.
Yeah.
And that all kind of goes together. And I think as we're now also looking, not just me wanting to design sustainable things and be more energy efficient, but collectively as a profession and collectively as a society, because we have to, we're looking at a lot more about how do we take care of the existing buildings we have and make them more energy efficient, make them less carbon emitting. We want to keep the climate, take care of the climate so that we are taking care of our planet.
Are any of these buildings occupied when you're dealing with them, or are they all unoccupied?
Oh, typically they're occupied.
They are.
Yeah. There are times where, depending on what the project is and how extensive it is and what the building type is, we have been able to do things on some projects where it's not occupied for a while until the work is done, and then they'll come back in.
Sure. You work on proposals? You work on like sort of every aspect of this thing?
I work on every aspect of it.
That's great, because you get close to the whole project, right? You get to see every aspect of it, which is good.
And you kind of, over your career, you kind of have to. Yeah. It's kind of like this cycle going through, that some of the things that once you have gone through an entire construction process, from initial feasibility studies or initial existing building conditions assessment through construction, you understand more of what you need in the early phases based on what you have to know in the later phases. We will spend time going and going to the building and measuring things and taking photographs and documenting things the way we need to, and bringing that documentation back to the office and drawing it up and turning that into a whole lot of drawing details. And the drawings have a lot of notes on them explaining what's going on, and they go along with a project manual, which is a series of specifications that's sorted and it's organized in a very specific way. Mm-hmm. That set of drawings and specifications is what the contractor says, I can do the things that are documented here for this price. Yep. They're, in essence, buying that and saying, this is what I'm going to do. And then at that point, once we have a contractor on the job, then our job changes a little bit in terms of, we are having the contractor check in with us. They will submit things to us and say, yes, you had called for this material. This is the material we're planning on using, and this is exactly how we're planning on making this happen. Or you called for this thing and we're not able to get it, and so we're going to do this. And we will work back and forth with them. Sure. It's like a conversation. And we'll go on site and we will meet with the contractor and the owner all the way through construction to make sure that the work is being done in the way that it needs to, so that it's safe, so that it's meeting the design intent, which is what we put together in those documents, nobody is an expert in everything. But our role as an architect is to kind of pull all of that together. So I understand I had classes in structural engineering, but I'm not a structural engineer. I understand to a certain extent. And then we will have a structural engineer who will really crunch the numbers and really look at everything the way we need to there. We will have a mechanical engineer, or we will have people with different areas of expertise that will be part of our team.
Right.
And part of our job is to coordinate all that and make sure all the pieces fit together. The other thing with preservation work that is different than new construction is that we're working with something that's already there. And so we will do everything we can to understand the building and as best as we can. There are times where we will call for probes, meaning there's something that we need to make sure we're understanding, and we will cut open a very carefully selected hole in the wall to understand something. Or there are different things that we can do with non-destructive evaluation. So there are ways that we can see things without actually having to cut a hole in the wall.
Yeah, of course.
We know a building was built in 1804, for example, and we know an awful lot about how that building was constructed for that building itself and other things from that time period. But if somebody came in 1972 and made this really weird thing happen that we looked in 7 other places in the walls, and then suddenly we get to this one spot where this really strange thing happened that we never could have anticipated, then suddenly the contractor's there and they're like, so guys, here's this thing.
I assume you're talking about shag carpeting.
But no, there are things that we will find, in the walls or in the roof, and we'll find ways to, with our whole team, we will go through and make sure that we'll find a solution to that and make sure that it's working for all the other pieces that it affects.
Very cool.
It's a lot of fun.
So how many jobs are you juggling during the...
So it varies. I think recently I've been working on about 3 to 4 projects at a time. Mm-hmm. And depending on the size of the project, depending on what's going on with it, depending on what phase we're in, we'll have more or fewer people working on it. And we have a lot of different areas of expertise within our office as well. So we've got a lot of people, most of the people in the office have a really strong preservation background. We also have people in the office who are really good at passive house design, which is a way to do very high performance, energy efficient design. In our office, we do that in existing buildings. We have people who are just amazing at investigating what's going on with the building and how it was constructed and where the problems may be and how to fix that. Right. And a lot of other things that are all happening at once. And there's also a range of ages and expertise. So we have people who've been working in all of these areas for decades. We also have younger, emerging professionals just coming out of school. And you'll find that in any office, and that's how we all grow within the profession.
Sure. What's your specialty? Is there something that people say, I can't figure this out, I got to go to Cory because she's the expert in this?
Well, I've been working in preservation my whole career. So that's that's the thing that I have a lot of expertise in. But parallel to that is one of the things that I really very much appreciate about this office is that this office has expertise in the sustainable design direction. On the side, in my professional organization, so my volunteer time in the profession, I have been doing an awful lot for years now working on sustainable preservation. And what are the things that we need to talk about and how does that work? And some of the big picture things and finding how these pieces fit together. I have not been the person who has spent time sitting and crunching the numbers of exactly what the energy performance of something is. I know conceptually how that works, and I know that it's something that we need for a number of reasons, and then I find the people who do that. And a lot of those people are in my office right now, which is amazing. And I am always learning from everybody there.
That's terrific. You're working on historic buildings.
Mm-hmm.
I assume not 100% of people want to go back to that historic look. Are there some folks that say, okay, well, the outside's historic looking, but we kind of want a modern interior? Is that something you would do and shore up the interior of the building so that they can go ahead and do that kind of stuff? Or is it strictly for going back for a historic look?
Again, it depends. Most of our projects are really dealing with the exterior of the building.
Right.
So when you're talking about preservation and talking about historic buildings, which is a subset of existing buildings. And there's an important distinction there. If it's historically significant, whether it is designated at the national and state level or whether it's designated at the city level, they generally overlap, but not always. If it is a really cool existing building that doesn't have any historic designation, there's a lot more leeway. But even within the designation levels, unless it is a designated interior space, typically the local Landmarks Preservation Commission is really concerned with what's going on the outside.
Got it.
So it really is going to depend on the type of building and its designation and all kinds of things like that.
Makes sense.
You know, I worked on a cathedral at one point, right? We've done paint samples. So what you do is you go and you scoop up with an X-Acto. I'm going to, without getting too technical about what's going on, you're scraping a chunk of paint and you embed it in resin and you slice through it so that you can look at it on its side and put it under a microscope and see all the layers of paint. And you can figure out this is what the colors were at various points in time.
Great.
And it's a way oversimplification. And anybody who's actually focused on that part will say, well, hold on, there's a lot more.
Right.
But
this is a very simple program and a simple podcast. So keep it simple for us stupid people.
But there are a lot of different tools that we have at our fingertips, whether it's something that we do in-house or whether it's with consultants that we work with quite a bit. Within the field of preservation, there's a lot of different areas of expertise. And so one of the most important things there is to understand where our expertise is directly in-house or what equipment we have in-house. Sometimes we know how to do it, but don't necessarily have that equipment, or we don't have that expertise, just like I was talking about a structural engineer.
Right.
We aren't going to take that on in-house. So part of that is the balance of how all of that works.
How many folks are being forced to make these changes because the building is unsafe? I assume you've got some of that, right?
Sure. It depends. And so there's an inspection, a mandatory inspection.
Sure.
And so when you have stuff that is not safe, you have to fix it.
Absolutely.
Whether the client wants to spend the money on it or not. But that's the case for any building, right? If you have a leak in your roof, you can't say, well, I'm going to put that off for a year. No, you kind of need to fix the leak.
I have.
But sure. And then you have all the issues that go with it. But so there are things where if the building is not safe, then you have to fix it.
Sure.
But the other thing that's happening right now in New York City a few years ago put together this Climate Mobilization Act. And with that, we're looking at the fact that buildings are responsible for 40% of the carbon emissions globally.
Wow.
Which is huge. Yeah. When you get to a dense building intensive place like New York City, buildings are responsible for about 70% of the emissions, meaning there's a lot that we need to do. We have a huge responsibility, but we also have a huge opportunity to make a difference.
Sure.
And a lot of that is, we need to do this globally to keep ourselves going on this planet. But, the city is being very proactive. New York and Boston is as well. And a number of places are now saying, hey, we need to make this happen. In New York City, the Climate Mobilization Act translates into a series of local laws. One of which is the Local Law 97, which talks about how buildings that are, larger buildings above a certain number of square feet, you have to measure how much energy you're using, but more specifically, how much carbon you're emitting. So, you can turn on the lights using a windmill or wind turbine. You could also do it from, coal-fired plant. And one is going to be emitting a lot of carbon into the air and the other is not. So because we're really looking at what we're doing to the climate, we really need to be talking about carbon rather than energy.
You had talked about how you want to hold on to older buildings. I'm assuming that's a big part of the argument here. Tell me a little more about the advantages of using an older building, keeping it. Obviously, people think of newer buildings and they think, energy efficient and lighter materials and more technological materials and things like that. But that's not necessarily the case, especially with what you're talking about, right?
It's true. It's not the case, in fact, and for a number of reasons. First, we'll start off with the distinction between energy and carbon. And the end goal here is reducing the amount of carbon we are emitting into the atmosphere and into the water. And that's really what's driving climate change. Human-induced climate change, which is exponentially more than what happens in a normal natural cycle without our intervention. And so what we're concerned with is making sure that we are not spewing all of this into the air and creating this heavier and heavier blanket that's, cooking us is really what's happening. So we want to make sure that we are reducing that. We're not building that blanket heavier and heavier. So when you look at carbon emissions, when you look at it from the perspective of buildings, you can really kind of divide it into two categories. Part of it is called, we'll talk about it in terms of embodied carbon or upfront carbon emissions. And the idea of that is that when you are making the materials, when you are extracting the clay out of the ground and cleaning it and putting it into a kiln and turning them into bricks and then transporting them, or if you're cutting down a tree and putting it through a mill or having a steel mill and making the steel, all of that doesn't happen by itself. There's a lot of carbon that's emitted with that. And some of it is also in the chemical reactions that happen. Concrete is a huge example of that. Part of it is just extracting the materials and moving the materials and things like that, but also the chemical reaction that happens when you put the Portland cement into the mix and you get it wet, and that chemical reaction that happens to turn all of those loose ingredients into concrete also emits a lot of carbon. All of these things all together in building a building, constructing a building, making any repairs, all of that, we'll talk about it in terms of embodied carbon or upfront carbon emissions. When you look at it over, the lifespan of all of these materials, roughly it's about half of the carbon emissions coming from buildings. The other half is heating and cooling and lighting and air conditioning and humidity control and plug loads, plugging in your iPhone and all of those things. And all of that we call operational carbon. For far too long, we've only been looking at the operational carbon. But when you figure that's half of it, and if we're talking 40% globally, 20%, 1/5 of the carbon emissions going into the atmosphere right now are coming from constructing our buildings.
Right. And you don't think of that as a
No.
layman. We don't think of that. We think of strictly how are we, the materials, they're here.
Mm-hmm.
We don't care how they got here. We don't
Right.
we don't look at it that way. We just look at, I'm just going to build, and that's it.
Right.
But you're right. It takes a lot of energy to come up with those materials and make them. So keeping an older building
is a huge part of it. And so if you figure right now, if we look from now forward to, say, 2050 or at any time, but we have a carbon budget that we are eating up like crazy right now. So if we start with our baseline of right now, what is constructed already, that has already happened. You don't want to that you're not going to get back. But if you were to take that building and you were to tear it down, there are emissions involved in that. And when you build something new, there are a ton of emissions involved with that. And it will take decades to, you could build the most energy efficient, most operational carbon efficient building going. It will take decades to recoup the cost, the carbon emissions of what you just lost. And we don't have that kind of time right now. And so if you figure what has already been built, figure that as being a huge resource. That's kind of like we have this bank of carbon that's already there. It's already been invested. That is there. Let's keep using that. The longer we can use that, the fewer new buildings we need for the same purpose.
Right.
We've all grown up in the 20th century and 21st as, in a very disposable society. We have this mindset, and there's so much that's lost with that.
So let me play devil's advocate.
Yes.
Okay, but is it going to be more expensive for me to have to do that? It's all about budget for me. I don't care about environmental. It's all about budget.
Sure.
Does using the older buildings, does it typically cost more to do that, rehash another building versus building a brand new one? Are we talking costs? Are they comparable in any way?
It really depends. It is not necessarily more expensive. In fact, if you're taking care of your building, that's going to be better for you in the long run, financially even, because it's already there. Right. You already have the infrastructure coming in. You already have the materials there. You already have the stuff there.
And good materials.
And good materials. Yeah.
Heavy materials.
Wood today is very different than wood 100 years ago. Yeah. It just, by the nature, the material has changed because of the way we now grow and harvest trees.
Right.
It's a very different material than what it used to be. Yep. the initial cost for these things had already happened. They're materials that you can't necessarily find anymore,
Sure.
but they were built at a certain point in time, and they will last a very, very long time if we take care of them. And so from a financial perspective, that's also really important. And also in understanding how that building works and how it was designed to be comfortable, to be durable, easily repaired, all of those things, you're not necessarily going to find that in new construction.
Right.
The technology of construction has changed.
Yes. What is the challenge of getting the word out that this needs to happen? Is it public policy that needs to change, or is it governmental, or is it just awareness of folks that own older buildings? What is it, or both, or?
It's both. It's a lot of things. So part of it, as we are shifting our mindset to understanding what's going on from a climate perspective, as we are understanding the way the different technologies are available now that weren't before, that I think is to a certain extent is an awareness from homeowners, from building owners, and understanding that in doing so, it makes your building much more comfortable. Really, I think that from an owner's perspective is pretty amazing. I mean, it will bring your energy costs down, but it also makes your building more comfortable. And this is especially when we get into the very high performance stuff, where we're really taking very good care of making sure that the building's very well insulated, that it's air sealed, and that also helps with the air quality. For example, with my, an associate principal in my office does a lot of work with, I was talking about Passive House, like this very high performance design, retrofits of existing buildings. She did that to her own home. She has a brownstone. And last summer, when we had those orange skies with all the wildfires in Quebec, is that all of that air was coming down, and here in the Northeast, we were all, we had these crazy eerie orange skies that were crazy polluted and everything else. The air quality in her home was still clean. And, there's the way that's set up. She made sure that the windows were closed and had the air filters going on. And there's a lot of air circulation happening. So it's certainly not like it's sealed up like there's a lot of air circulation. So she was constantly getting fresh air, but it was filtered. So from that perspective, from an owner's perspective, I think that's really important as we are talking about things like making sure, what different regulations, like the ones that are happening in New York and Boston, where if you are emitting too much carbon, you are going to start getting fined. And those fines, like the limits are getting more and more stringent. That allows us as building professionals to work with homeowners and building owners to say, okay, this is something that you're going to need to do right now. The next time you're really going to be doing a lot of work on the building is, say, 20 years from now. So in the meantime, let's plan out for these 20 years. Yep. From a policy perspective, this is where I get back to the embodied versus operational carbon part. We are right now in New York and in a lot of places really looking at the operational carbon side, right? We want to make sure that the building is insulated so we don't need to do as much heating and cooling and that whole step down thing. But we also need to be looking at the embodied carbon part. That's the other half of the equation. We need to make sure that our policies are incentivizing hanging on to our buildings, hanging on to what we have and taking care of it rather than tearing it down and building new. And that is starting to happen in some places. In a number of European countries, that's really happening. The state of California just started passing some regulations for that. And that's something that's going to need to start happening from a policy perspective. Mm-hmm. But it all goes together there in terms of making it more important for a lot more people to understand the importance of hanging on to your existing buildings.
That's good. You gotta get that word out. And
yeah.
I think the average person like myself doesn't really think of buildings as being a detriment to bad ecology, but clearly it is. All we think of is cars. That's the thing that's been rammed down our throats for years and years, but clearly, buildings have a big part of that.
I think our way of viewing things is where we need to reconsider things. Our view of things being disposable is very problematic.
When you talk about being a preservation architect, mm-hmm. This is not the road I thought we were going to be going down.
No, of course not.
Which is terrific because, I'm thinking you're doing research in what color paint they used, what kind of paint they used. We want to match the windows. We want to match the trim, make sure it's all that. But that's clearly not, I'm sure
part of it. That's
yeah.
a big part of it. That's
Right.
and I think I maybe one of the things that an architect does quite a bit is jump in different scales because we're thinking at different scales all the time. And yeah, we do a lot of that. And that's part of what we do with the work. Yeah, we do the investigation into all those things. We make sure that the window trim profile is matching what it was historically. Or if we don't know we make sure that what we're doing is appropriate. And that's a big part of it too. But you can look at that all in service to a couple big things. One, keeping the building going and making sure that it's comfortable for the people living in it. Two, making sure that we are doing our part to make everything comfortable as a society, as a climate, so that we can continue living in our buildings and making sure that they're resilient and durable to the way the climate is changing. So with, depending, like if you're close to the ocean, you're confronted with sea level rise right there, things like that, or in places where there are a lot of wildfires. And there are all of those pieces, but also purely on the preservation side, there's a lot of value in hanging on to our existing technologies, like understanding what was there, hanging on to our history, to our cultural heritage, and doing things in a way that we are not forgetting what we had, that we still have that physical evidence of things. And part of that also gets into making sure that we are telling all of the stories. It's not just George Washington. It's not just Alexander Hamilton. It's all of the stories that maybe going back and making sure that some of the stories that haven't been told yet that some of the technologies and the traditions that have been overlooked are no longer overlooked, that they are understood and honored and part of our collective history and our collective story.
So I'm assuming if somebody came to you and said, hey, this was built with asbestos, we need to be period correct, get some more asbestos in here. That's not going to be your response, I'm assuming.
Typically not. No, absolutely not. There are some interesting conversations that are happening these days as mid-century modern buildings are hitting that 50-year mark and actually going beyond that. We're now talking the 1970s in terms of what's hitting 50 years old. And so the 20th century was a very interesting century in terms of an awful lot of experimentation, a lot of new materials, a lot of all of it. Yeah. And so there are an awful lot of questions right now in my field in terms of how do we address some of these? Yeah. And they're different challenges than the challenges that exist with a building from the 18th and 19th centuries. Sure. And so there are a lot of amazing things that have happened. There are things that are maybe not so amazing. And that's not just the 20th century. Sure. There are things in the past as well that you always have to balance out what's going on and why.
So you're saying humans are pretty awful, but not completely awful.
I'm saying we're not perfect. We're still learning. And, there's good and bad that comes with that.
Lotsofmaps.com. Vintage, local, national, and world maps for an affordable price. 99% of our maps are $25 or less. Great as gifts. Frame them or put them under glass for your home, vacation home, or as a memory of a special place. Lotsofmaps.com.
So I can tell just by the way you're presenting this to me, you are completely passionate about your job. That is the one tie-in, the word that I would tie into all the people I've interviewed so far is the passion about what they do. Clearly, you've got that. You're passionate about what you do. You're excited about what you do. And it's something you've had since you were 11, which is amazing.
You spend more waking hours doing the work you do than anything else. And this is not a profession without its challenges. You have to love what you're doing. Sure. And I really love what I'm doing. I love that it is something that challenges the parts of my brain that I always find that I enjoy, the things that I enjoy pursuing. I maybe even more importantly enjoy the bigger purposes for what we're doing. Mm-hmm. That there are things that are making people's lives more comfortable, that we are hanging on to our cultural heritage, which is huge. We all have different ways that we can do this. And I very much love that what we're doing, what I get to do every day is something that's making a difference in a way that I am happy about and I'm proud of.
I'm doing no good for the earth at all. I'm not really hurting it, but I don't think. But I'm definitely not doing anything good of the earth. So
you're getting to tell stories and getting people out there and excited and passionate about what they're doing. So I think
and I'm glad I'm friends with people that are actually doing good things.
You're getting the word out. Don't we need to get the word out about these things?
That's true. We do.
You are getting the word out.
I am an ecological master, clearly.
There you go.
Listen, if you ever need an expert in your office on building with popsicle sticks, I'm your guy.
Excellent.
I built a heck of a log cabin when I was a kid with Elmer's glue and popsicle sticks, and I'm
the
your
next
guy.
time that proposal comes in, we'll reach out to you to be our consultant.
Excellent, excellent. So is there a part of your job that you enjoy more than others? Or is there something that is, really a favorite of yours? What part of the job really makes you happy?
So a lot of things make me happy in my job. There are parts in like any job that are, that I enjoy more than others, and some that are, maybe not my favorite. One of the things that I've always really liked about working in preservation is getting to be kind of a detective. Like there's a kind of an investigative forensic aspect to it. When we're going into a building and we're figuring out, specifically when it's a historically significant building, you're trying to figure out things about what it was at some point in time or how it changed. And a lot of that is done through spending time in the building. And a lot of that, we're measuring things, I'm taking notes, but a lot of it is like looking for evidence.
So you're like an archaeologist.
I'm an
really,
archaeologist.
right?
Yeah. And so there, and part of it is understanding the materials enough, understanding how things are constructed enough. And you start looking at things. And sometimes it's a matter of, say, looking, where there are little holes in the wall that you can look and say, oh, it's a wood frame construction, or, oh, look, it's wood, but there's bricks in between the wood studs. Well, actually, that had a reason because that was, for example, in one building when we had that was something that was done back in the early 1800s as a way to keep the rodents out of the house. They can't crawl through brick walls.
Right.
And there are things like that, but then you start looking.
At least then they couldn't. I
No.
think now they can eat right through
Well,
bricks,
if they
right?
can eat the pizza on the subway, then they can totally eat the brick.
Good point. Good point.
But investigating things and understanding how it works, when you're doing that, you're also, there's a lot of care that's taken in terms of measuring things and recording that, documenting it. There's this whole process of measured drawings and taking field measurements, and you're putting things together very carefully in your notes and bringing it back to the office and drawing it. And you start to learn the skill set of what you need to measure, what you need to make note of, and bring it back and how that translates into what you're doing.
Have you ever been stumped?
Oh, yeah.
When you open up a wall and you go, what is happening here? I don't understand why they did this or how they did this, or... I mean, you get stumped?
Oh, yeah. You're typically not stumped forever.
Yeah.
There are things where it doesn't compute with what else you know about the building or what you know about typology and time period and all of those things. And so you kind of keep those in the back of your head as you're working. And then you will very often find something else that makes sense with it. And so part of it is putting together a three-dimensional puzzle. As you're going and noting, taking photographs and field measurements and making all these notes of understanding what the building is, you very often start where you start seeing things that seem funny. And there are these puzzles and these questions that you put into your head. As you keep going, then you start to see how that translates to something else. Sometimes there are things on your first pass with what you can see just from what's readily available, you can't tell. And then you say, well, we need to understand more about this. And so this is where we're concerned that there might be an issue here. So we're going to request to the owner that we spend a little bit more time doing some sort of investigation, whether it is having a certain type of equipment that we can use to investigate something about what's going on in the wall or the roof or wherever, that piece of the building, or something where we might need to open up a hole, a probe to look at it to see what's going on. And as we do that, we'll go through and, in any of those cases, we will be very careful and evaluate what's going on. There are times where we find things that we never anticipated. There was a house that I worked on years ago in New York City where when the building changed use, it was originally a house and then it turned into a church bought it, and they, as their church congregation was moving uptown, they made use of this house as their worship space for a while their actual church was being built. And they made some significant changes. And we were trying to restore it back to what it was originally. And we thought that the staircase was replaced. We knew that little pieces like this stair tread was original. This one looks like it's original. It wasn't until we were able to start pulling it apart that we found that the majority of it was original. They had switched the direction of it. So what was the outside face of the stairs, it was sandwiched between the wall and the stair. And there was this beautiful decoration, this scroll work decoration that was very period appropriate, but we had no idea that it was there. And we weren't going to make it up. Right. That's one of the things that you don't do. You don't try to recreate a history that you don't know. But we didn't realize that that was there. And as the work was being done and we were taking this segment of the stair out to work with it, we discovered a lot of details that we never anticipated. And so from that, we were able to restore that. And where that pattern was missing, we knew what it was so we could replicate it. Wow, and cool. It gave us so much more information, and it was just amazing. And so one of the things that I really love about what we do is that discovery process and how that fits in and how we go about doing so with the drawings and the investigation and the care and attention to detail that goes with it. Some of it is from the materials, that we know enough about, if a building was built, say, in the early 1800s, and we see a material that didn't come into use until the 20th century, we know that material's not original. Right. And by documenting where those non-historic materials are and where the historic materials are, that helps us date where changes were made, when different things happened, what may be original, what is most definitely not original, and helps us tell the story of the building. That's and great. I love that storytelling part.
I was expecting you to say something like, we found a dead body in the wall, or a big pile of cash, or Rudy Giuliani's hidden gold.
Is that where it is? Oh, yeah, where's his source of his hair dye?
Exactly. We struck hair dye. We struck hair dye.
Yes.
All right, this is a tough one. Top 3 buildings in New York. You got to give me an answer.
Some of the iconic ones are pretty fascinating. I used to have a view of the Empire State Building from my desk. And so I have this whole collection of photos of the Empire State Building, different times of day, different weather. They have this amazing lighting that they do now that they've changed it out into LED lights. I mean, they've always, for as far as long back as I know, they've had, they'll put different colors up on the building to signify different things. They have so many more capabilities with that now, to the point, now I'll look at it and be like, all right, what's the significance today? And you can go online and find out. And like, oh, this is really cool. I do always have a soft spot there for the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building and Grand Central and all of the very iconic buildings.
That leads me to another question.
Okay.
I know you're in the middle of answering this. What's your favorite era? I mean, are you talking about... I love Deco. I mean, there's nothing like Deco. And you just mentioned 3 buildings that are Deco.
Buildings go through a time period where it's built and it's brand new and it's amazing and it's innovative and how cool. And then it becomes kind of passé, and then it's out of style. And then, oh my God, this is so awful. How could anybody do this? We need to tear this down. Once it comes out on the other side, it's kind of retro. It's kind of cool. Oh my goodness, this is the coolest thing from this. We need to hang on to this and save it forever. And I've worked on different buildings. Years ago, I worked on a building, a courthouse out in central New York that was built, I think, in the 1870s. It had a lot of, it had these 2 towers on it. It had this really cool Queen Anne, I think, or Victoria, a lot of fancy detailing on it and everything. At a certain point in the time period, once it hit that low point, the people in that town were like, this is crazy. This is so ugly. We need to modernize it. They tore down those really cool mansard roofs on those towers and did something much more simple and much more, in their view, modern and of the time and all of these things. When I was looking at the building, we did at that point in time, we were looking at it in terms of what to do. How do we restore the building? Can it continue functioning as a courthouse? How do we do these things? One of the things that we were looking at, and the people who were there, were like, what were they thinking? Why did they tear that stuff down? Now we're going to go back and try to recreate that, but why did they tear it down in the first place? With that idea in mind, I've always been very cognizant of the fact that all buildings go through that time period. And I don't have to love the building myself to respect it and honor it for what it is. Because if it's not me, we're not going to be the last people working on this building. Right. At some point in time, something that seems ugly to me may be something that's going to be just absolutely adored and admired, even 5-10 years from now. Right now, we collectively are going through that with the mid-century stuff. All of the stuff, all the glass towers and all of that kind of stuff, suddenly everyone is looking at it like, this is like Mad Men. This is so cool. This is amazing. We're now getting into the brutalist, the exposed concrete buildings, like Boston City Hall. That is so ugly. Oh my God, we're still kind of in that. That's starting to make its way through, but we are all too close to it. It's in that that low point. Yep. And I have a number of friends and colleagues who are of the mindset of this stuff is really awesome and it's heroic architecture. And it doesn't matter whether it's my preference or not, or the postmodern stuff that comes after that, or the, any time period. If you're too close to it and it's in that low point, in my position as a preservation architect, I need to be aware of a longer arc of history. Right. And I need to honor the building for what it is, no matter what my own personal preference is, and understand that even my own preference 10 years from now may change, but understand that building needs to get through that low point to get out on the other side and to be really appreciated for what it is.
It's a very diplomatic answer.
But it's an important one in the field that I'm in.
Yeah. Can you promise me that you will bring back gargoyles on buildings? Because I really miss those.
I love gargoyles. And they are the coolest thing.
Cory Trembath-Rouillard, thank you so much for telling us a little bit about your job. It's fascinating. It's fascinating what you do. Was not expecting a lot of what I heard today, which was really great. And it's a pleasure that you enjoy your job and that you're doing good things with it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Stay tuned for another episode of Occupations coming soon.
Occupations has been brought to you by lotsofmaps.com. Please follow Occupations the podcast on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to find information about our next episode or to see what past episodes are available.